Sophie sat by the window, the soft afternoon light spilling across her small apartment like a quiet promise of something she couldn't yet name. Outside, the city moved in its usual relentless rhythm. People hurrying past, cars honking in the distance, the faint hum of life all around her. Yet inside, everything felt unusually still, almost suspended, as if the world had forgotten her. She wrapped her hands around a mug of tea, inhaling the faint scent of chamomile. It was a comfort she had come to rely on. Something steady, something familiar in a life that often felt unsteady. Sophie had always been a creature of careful habits. Her mornings were predictable, her evenings quiet, and her weekends spent wandering bookstores, sipping coffee, or getting lost in a library corner with novels she'd read 100 times. Life had a rhythm and she liked it that way. But lately the rhythm felt hollow. Sophie's gaze wandered to the small photograph on her windowsill. A picture of a smiling woman with soft, warm eyes and an infectious laugh. Claire, her godaunt, had always been a constant presence in her life, visiting on holidays, sending thoughtful cards, or calling just to check in. Claire had a way of making everything feel lighter, of filling a room with gentle warmth simply by being there. Yet, Sophie realized with a quiet ache that she had only ever admired her from a distance. She had never really considered that the bond they shared could be something more complicated. A soft knock at the door broke her reverie. Sophie frowned slightly. No one was supposed to visit today. Her heart skipped a beat, a flutter of anticipation that she quickly tried to ignore. "Coming," she called, setting her mug down and straightening her sweater. When she opened the door, the sight of Claire standing there made Sophie's chest tighten in a way she hadn't expected. Claire looked just as she always did, elegant, poised, and radiating a calm confidence. But something in her eyes made Sophie pause. There was a softness there, a vulnerability that Sophie hadn't noticed before. "Hi, Sophie. I hope I'm not disturbing you," Claire said, her voice as warm and gentle as ever. "No, not at all," Sophie replied, stepping aside to let her in. "It's nice to see you." Claire smiled, brushing off her coat. "I was in the neighborhood and thought I'd stop by. I hope that's okay." Sophie nodded, suddenly aware of how much she wanted to say something. Anything that didn't come out. Words felt clumsy in her mouth, inadequate to the strange, fluttering feeling in her chest. They moved into the living room, and for a while, they sat in companionable silence. The rain outside began again, tapping lightly against the glass, filling the space with a calm, rhythmic soundtrack. Sophie watched Claire as she settled onto the sofa, folding her hands in her lap. There was something in the way she moved, graceful yet relaxed, that made Sophie feel both comforted and unsettled at the same time. It was the kind of presence that drew attention without demanding it, that filled a room quietly yet completely. Sophie had admired it for years, but today, that admiration felt like the tip of a deeper emotion she didn't fully understand. Claire tilted her head slightly, noticing Sophie's gaze. "You're quiet today," she observed softly. Sophie laughed nervously, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "Just thinking, I guess. It's been a long week." "I know the feeling," Claire said, her tone gentle, understanding. "Sometimes, all you need is a quiet moment, don't you think?" Sophie nodded, feeling a swell of gratitude. Claire always seemed to know the right thing to say, the right presence to offer. But today it was different. Today, Sophie felt a longing she hadn't named. A desire for connection, for warmth, for something beyond the ordinary rhythm of her life. She didn't fully understand it, but she couldn't ignore it. "Claire, can I ask you something?" Sophie finally said, her voice tentative. "Of course," Claire replied, tilting her head slightly, curiosity and patience in her expression. Sophie hesitated, her fingers twisting in her lap. "Have you ever felt like someone could mean more to you than you realized? Like a friend, or a family member? Someone you've always known suddenly feels different." Claire's eyes softened, and she reached out to rest a reassuring hand on Sophie's. "I think everyone feels that way at some point," she said gently. "Sometimes we don't notice it until the moment hits us unexpectedly." Sophie swallowed hard, her heart pounding. That unexpected moment. It was coming, she could feel it. And somehow deep inside, she knew her life was about to shift in ways she hadn't imagined. The rain continued to fall outside, a quiet drumbeat to the storm of thoughts in Sophie's mind. She didn't yet know what was coming, But for the first time in a long while, she felt a flicker of hope, of anticipation, of possibility. Something was about to change. And somehow, Sophie knew that when it did, nothing would ever feel ordinary again. The soft sound of rain outside had faded to a gentle drizzle by the time Sophie poured a second cup of tea. She and Claire had moved to the sofa, their conversation meandering like a quiet river, touching lightly on trivial matters, the neighborhood, old friends, favorite books, but beneath the words, something deeper lingered. Sophie's mind wandered to the past, to the countless afternoons she had spent with Claire over the years. As a child, Sophie had adored her godaunt in a way that felt simple and innocent. The way Claire would read stories aloud with expressive voices, or take her to the little park nearby, letting her chase autumn leaves while laughing freely. Claire had always been gentle, patient, and full of warmth, a constant in Sophie's life when other things felt uncertain. Even as Sophie grew older, their bond remained quietly steadfast. Claire had been there for every milestone, from school achievements to first heartbreaks. There had been sleepovers during holidays, long letters sent in carefully folded envelopes, and phone calls late at night when Sophie needed advice. Each moment had built an invisible thread between them, weaving a closeness that was more than family, though Sophie had never considered it anything else. And yet, there had always been distance. Life, with its unrelenting busyness, had placed boundaries between them. Sophie had moved into the city for work, and Claire had pursued her own life, traveling often, maintaining her career, and keeping her world carefully organized. Their lives were connected, but always at a polite distance, fond, loving, yet never fully converging. Sophie sipped her tea, her thoughts drifting to one particular memory. She was 10 years old, curled up on the living room floor while Claire sat in the armchair beside her, reading from a storybook in that soft, musical voice Sophie had always adored. It wasn't just the stories themselves that left a mark. It was the way Claire made Sophie feel seen, understood, and completely safe. Sophie had felt then, without understanding, that these moments were precious and fleeting, and she had cherished them quietly in the corners of her heart. Another memory surfaced, this one from her teenage years. Sophie had returned home from a disappointing day at school, burdened with self-doubt and the awkwardness of growing up. Claire had met her at the door with a warm hug, a cup of cocoa, and a gentle conversation that somehow made Sophie feel lighter, even if just for a moment. That day, Sophie realized something she hadn't named, that the comfort she felt in Claire's presence went beyond friendship or family. It felt like a safe harbor, a quiet understanding that she couldn't find anywhere else. And yet, life had kept them apart in subtle ways. Sophie had never dared voice the depth of her feelings, unsure if they were appropriate or even real. Claire had remained a figure of admiration, love, and respect, someone untouchable in her mind, someone to be cherished but never crossed into longing or desire. Sophie had told herself it was enough to love quietly from afar, to treasure the connection without claiming it. Now, as Claire sat beside her, the past and present seemed to converge. Sophie noticed the faint lines at the corners of Claire's eyes, the subtle grace in her gestures, the warmth that seemed to radiate even in silence. It was both comforting and unsettling, as though the years of careful distance had been replaced with something far more palpable. Claire spoke softly, interrupting Sophie's thoughts. "Do you remember the summer at Lakewood?" she asked, a small smile tugging at her lips. "The one when we got caught in that sudden rainstorm and had to run back to the cabin, soaked to the bone?" Sophie laughed, the sound mingling with the quiet drizzle outside. "I remember," she said. "You carried my little bag and refused to let me complain. You even sang that silly song while we ran." Claire chuckled. "I wanted to make it fun. You were always so serious even as a child. I didn't want you to miss the magic of that moment." Sophie felt a warmth bloom in her chest, a mix of nostalgia and longing. That summer had been one of the rare times their lives had fully overlapped, when Sophie had felt that invisible thread between them stretched tighter, more tangible. And yet, even then, they had been separated by the unspoken rules of their relationship. Claire as the godaunt, Sophie as the niece figure. It had never occurred to either of them that the bond could carry a different weight, a deeper, more emotional pull. Now, with Claire here sitting beside her, talking softly about memories they both cherished, Sophie felt the distance that had existed for years begin to shrink. There was a quiet electricity in the room, a gentle tension that wasn't alarming but unmistakable. It was the realization that the connection they had shared for so long had been growing quietly, in ways neither of them had named until now. Sophie swallowed hard, trying to steady the flutter in her chest. She couldn't say why her heart seemed to recognize Claire in a new, more profound way, but she knew that the years of shared memories, of closeness, of unspoken understanding, had brought them to this moment. Something was shifting, delicate and inevitable, like the first hint of spring after a long winter. Claire reached out, resting her hand briefly on Sophie's. It was a gesture so familiar, yet today it carried a weight neither of them could ignore. "I've missed these moments," Claire said quietly. "I think I've missed you." Sophie's breath caught. The words were simple, yet they carried the depth of years of longing, of feelings carefully kept under wraps. And in that instant, Sophie realized that the bond they had always shared, pure, gentle and safe, was evolving. Something tender and emotional was awakening, slowly, quietly, and irrevocably. The rain outside had nearly stopped, leaving the world soft and shimmering, just like the fragile emotions now rising between them. Sophie didn't yet know what the future held, but she understood one thing. The past had brought them here to this exact moment, and nothing would ever feel quite the same again. The next morning, Sophie woke to sunlight spilling softly across her room. The air smelled faintly of rain and earth, a quiet freshness that reminded her of childhood walks with Claire through the city park. Sophie stretched and glanced at her phone. A message from Claire blinked on the screen. "Thought I'd stop by this afternoon if that's okay. No pressure." Her heart skipped a beat. She hesitated for a moment, then typed back, "Of course. I'd love that." By the time Claire arrived, the day had turned warm, with golden sunlight glinting off wet pavements and leaves still dotted with droplets from last night's rain. Sophie opened the door and there was Claire, carrying a small tote bag and smiling like she always did, effortlessly warm, a little mysterious, entirely captivating. "Hi, Sophie," Claire said softly, her voice carrying a gentle excitement. "I hope I'm not intruding." "Never," Sophie replied. "Come in." They settled in the living room, tea mugs in hand, the familiar comfort of each other's presence wrapping around them like a soft blanket. But today something felt different. Even in these quiet, ordinary moments, there was an intensity beneath the surface. Their past closeness had been tender, but now the emotions simmered more vividly. Hope, longing, and something neither of them fully understood. As Claire unpacked a small bundle from her bag, Sophie noticed a framed photograph of the two of them from years ago, laughing on a park bench during one of their many shared walks. "I found this while cleaning," Claire said, handing it to Sophie. "I thought maybe it should be here with you." Sophie took the frame, her fingers brushing against Claire's briefly. The touch was fleeting, but it carried a weight that neither could ignore. She stared at the photograph, memories flooding back. The laughter, the shared secrets, the quiet comfort of simply being together. "It's beautiful," Sophie said softly, her voice catching slightly. "I hadn't realized how much I missed us until now." Claire's eyes softened, and for a moment neither spoke. The room was filled with a gentle tension, like the calm before a storm that promised something life-changing. Then, almost as if compelled by coincidence, a small sound interrupted them, a sudden crash from the kitchen. Sophie jumped slightly and Claire laughed, a delicate musical sound that made Sophie's chest tighten. "I think my clumsiness is contagious," Claire said, standing and heading to the kitchen. Sophie followed, and together they discovered that a small potted plant had fallen, spilling soil across the floor. Claire knelt to clean it up, and Sophie crouched beside her, their hands meeting as they worked. There was no awkwardness, just a shared focus and the silent acknowledgement of the closeness that had grown over years. "You always make even little accidents feel less chaotic," Sophie said quietly, her eyes meeting Claire's. Claire smiled, a subtle blush rising on her cheeks. "Maybe it's because we always seem to find our balance together," she replied softly. Sophie felt her heart flutter, a strange mixture of nostalgia, longing, and the sudden awareness of how deeply she cared for Claire. She realized that this simple everyday moment, a spilled plant, a shared laugh, a touch of hands, had ignited feelings she had carefully kept in the background for years. After they tidied the mess, they moved to the balcony, overlooking the city that sparkled under the clearing sky. The air was warm but carried the freshness of rain, and Sophie felt a strange calmness, as if the world itself had paused to let them breathe together. Do you ever think about how small moments can change everything? Claire asked, her gaze fixed on the horizon. All the time, Sophie admitted. Sometimes it's a glance, a laugh, or even something as simple as a spilled plant. She smiled, her heart lighter than it had been in months. I think we've had a lot of small moments like that, haven't we? Claire turned to her, her eyes reflecting the sunlight, and for the first time, Sophie saw something unguarded, something profoundly tender. We have, Claire said quietly. And maybe it's time we stop pretending they don't mean more than they seem. Sophie's chest tightened. She had felt this before, in the quiet of the past, in memories that lingered in the corners of her heart. But now, Claire was saying it aloud. The words, simple and unassuming, carried the weight of years of shared history, and of feelings that had quietly grown into something undeniable. The moment stretched between them, gentle and unhurried, filled with the electricity of recognition, the recognition that the bond they had always cherished had evolved into something more emotional, more real, and impossible to ignore. Sophie took a deep breath, feeling the warmth of Claire's presence, the closeness that had always been there but was now undeniable. The day outside seemed brighter, the air sharper, the world more vivid. And in that instant she realized that fate, coincidence, and small events had all conspired to bring them to this point. A moment of clarity, of quiet acknowledgement, of connection that felt as though it had been waiting for years. Sophie smiled, her heart full of hope and the tender ache of longing. Whatever the future held, she knew that this twist of fate had changed everything. And she was ready to embrace it. The late afternoon sun spilled softly through the curtains, painting the living room in warm golden hues. Sophie sat quietly on the sofa, her hands folded over the mug of tea she had long since forgotten to drink. Across from her, Claire leaned back in her chair, eyes distant yet thoughtful, a gentle crease forming between her brows. Neither spoke for several minutes, but the silence was not uncomfortable. It was heavy with unspoken words, with emotions both of them had carried for years. Sophie's heart pounded in her chest, each beat louder than the last, as she tried to find the courage to break the quiet. Finally she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. Do you ever feel like there are things you've wanted to say for a long time but never did? Claire's eyes softened and she leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees. Every day, she admitted. There are always thoughts I keep tucked away. Memories and feelings I'm not sure how to share. Sophie nodded, a lump forming in her throat. She thought of all the moments they had spent together over the years, the shared laughter, the quiet walks, the small comforts of companionship that had felt so ordinary at the time, yet now seemed profound. She thought of the longing she had kept hidden, of feelings she had convinced herself were inappropriate to name. And now, seeing the same hesitation reflected in Claire's eyes, she felt a strange mix of relief and fear. It's funny, Sophie continued, her voice trembling slightly, how life puts you next to someone every day, or in little pieces over years, and you don't realize how much they matter to you until it's almost too late. Claire's gaze lingered on her, warm and unwavering. I know exactly what you mean, she said softly. I've felt that way about you for as long as I can remember, but I didn't want to risk our relationship, or the comfort of what we've always had. Sophie swallowed hard, the words she had longed to hear finally spoken aloud. Her chest ached with the weight of relief and longing, and she reached instinctively for Claire's hand. The contact was tentative, careful, yet electric in its subtlety. You mean you've felt it too? Sophie asked, her voice cracking with the fragile hope she had carried for so long. Claire nodded, a soft smile touching her lips. Yes. I didn't know how to say it, and I think we were both afraid of what it could change. For a moment they simply held hands, the room filled with the quiet symphony of unspoken truth. It was not a dramatic confession or a sudden revelation. It was something much deeper, much gentler. A recognition of the bond they had always shared, now illuminated by honesty and courage. Sophie's mind raced with memories, the childhood afternoons spent laughing at Claire's silly jokes, the teenage years when Claire's presence had been her anchor through storms of self-doubt, and the quiet evenings when Claire had always seemed to understand her heart without words. Every memory now took on a new hue, a subtle glow of meaning she had never allowed herself to see before. I thought some feelings should never be named, Sophie admitted, her voice barely audible, Because if you say them out loud, they might change everything. And I wasn't ready for that. Claire's thumb brushed gently over the back of Sophie's hand. Sometimes the only way they change everything is for them to finally be spoken, she said softly. I think life gives us those moments, and then waits for us to be brave enough to see them. Sophie felt her chest tighten with emotion. She had imagined this conversation 100 times in her mind, each scenario ending differently, each one filled with uncertainty. But now with Claire here, with her words finally out in the open, the fear that had haunted her seemed lighter, tempered by a quiet hope she hadn't dared to feel before. They sat in silence again, not awkwardly, but with the peaceful weight of two people finally acknowledging what they had always known in their hearts. There was longing, yes, but also gratitude, for every moment that had led to this, for every shared smile, every shared tear, and every memory that had built the foundation of their connection. Claire leaned back slightly, eyes thoughtful. I think we've spent too long pretending that ordinary closeness was enough, she said quietly. There's something here, something important, that deserves attention, that deserves care. Sophie's eyes glistened as she nodded, tears threatening to fall. I felt it too. I just didn't know how to tell you. The moment stretched between them, delicate and profound. It was not dramatic or rushed. There were no grand gestures or declarations, only the shared understanding of hearts that had always known one another, waiting patiently for the right time to speak. And in that quiet golden room with the late sun casting soft shadows around them, Sophie and Claire felt the unspoken truth finally acknowledged. They didn't need to define it fully, yet. They didn't need to label it or rush it. For now it was enough to recognize it, to feel it, and to hold it together. Some things they realized didn't need words to be real. And some truths, once finally spoken, could change everything without a single dramatic gesture. The evening settled over the city like a gentle sigh, painting rooftops and streets in the soft glow of twilight. Sophie and Claire sat together on the balcony, the fading light catching in Claire's hair and reflecting off the small droplets of rain from earlier in the day. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of wet earth and the distant hum of city life. Sophie's hands clutched her tea mug, the warmth barely reaching her chest where her heart raced. She had replayed every moment of the afternoon in her mind, from the subtle brush of Claire's hand to the quiet, charged glances they had exchanged. Something had shifted between them, an invisible thread now taut with unspoken emotion. Claire leaned back, looking out at the skyline. Sophie, she began, her voice unusually soft, almost hesitant. There's something I need to tell you. I can't keep it inside any longer. Sophie's breath caught. The words she had longed to hear, feared to hear, and hoped for were finally coming. She felt a mixture of anticipation and nervousness, the quiet ache in her chest suddenly sharper, demanding acknowledgement. I've always felt it, Claire continued, turning to face her fully. Even when we were younger, even when I thought it was safer to stay silent. You've always mattered to me more than I could explain. And lately, it's impossible to pretend that it's just a simple bond of family or friendship. Sophie's eyes widened slightly, tears brimming. The words were gentle, careful, yet carried a weight that touched every corner of her heart. All the longing she had buried for years, the admiration, the quiet hope, the yearning, now had a voice, and it was being spoken directly to her. Claire, Sophie whispered, her voice trembling. I've felt the same way. For so long I told myself it wasn't right to feel this, that maybe I was imagining it. But hearing you say it, it feels like coming home. Claire reached out slowly, her hand brushing against Sophie's in a tentative, deliberate gesture. Their fingers intertwined naturally, as though they had always belonged that way. Sophie felt a warmth bloom through her, the kind that was steady, comforting, and thrilling all at once. I was scared, Claire admitted. Scared that if I said anything I might ruin what we've always had. But staying silent, it was even worse. I couldn't let another day pass without being honest. Sophie nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek. I understand. I was scared too. Scared of what it could mean. Scared of losing the comfort of having you in my life. But now, I feel like all the years of waiting and wondering have led to this exact moment. The city below them was alive with lights and movement, but up here on the balcony time seemed to slow. The ordinary sounds of evening, the distant chatter, the hum of traffic, the rustle of leaves, felt like the perfect soundtrack to the extraordinary truth now unfolding between them. Claire's voice softened even more, gentle but unwavering. "Sophie, I care about you deeply, and I think we owe it to ourselves to see where this can go, to allow ourselves to explore this connection fully without fear or hesitation." Sophie's heart swelled with emotion. She felt the years of longing, of quiet admiration, of tender affection, finally acknowledged, mirrored, and reciprocated. "I've waited for this without even realizing I was waiting," she admitted, her voice breaking slightly. "I don't want to hide anymore. I don't want to pretend we're just what we've always been." Claire smiled softly, a mixture of relief and joy in her eyes. "Neither do I," she said, her hand squeezing Sophie's gently. "It's time we stop pretending and start embracing what's real between us." They sat there for a while longer side by side, their hands linked, hearts beating in unison. It wasn't dramatic in a flashy sense. No grand gestures, no proclamations shouted into the wind, but it was profoundly intimate, deeply moving, and life-changing in its quiet honesty. The turning point wasn't an event in the outside world. It was the decision to speak the truth, to acknowledge feelings long kept in the shadows. Sophie rested her head lightly against Claire's shoulder, feeling the steady rhythm of her heartbeat. For years she had carried this quiet longing, unsure if it would ever be returned. Now, in the gentle glow of evening, it was returned, fully and without condition. "I can't believe we finally said it," Sophie whispered, her voice full of awe and gratitude. "Me neither," Claire replied softly, leaning her head just a fraction closer. "But sometimes the best things in life are worth waiting for." Sophie closed her eyes, letting the warmth of the moment fill her completely. It was a turning point, not just in their relationship but in the way she saw the world, in the way she allowed herself to hope, to feel, and to love openly. And in that quiet golden evening, with the city alive around them and their hearts finally in sync, Sophie and Claire knew that everything had changed. They didn't need to rush, they didn't need to plan the future yet. For now the truth had been spoken, and it was enough. The following morning dawned soft and golden, the kind of sunlight that made even the ordinary seem gentle and full of possibility. Sophie woke to the quiet hum of the city beyond her window, the warmth of Claire's presence beside her a comforting constant. Last night's conversation, the turning point of their long unspoken feelings, still lingered in her heart, leaving her both exhilarated and serene. Sophie stretched and looked across the room. Claire was curled up on the sofa, a soft blanket around her shoulders, reading quietly. For a long moment Sophie simply watched her, taking in the ease and calm that radiated from her godaunt, the same presence that had always been a source of comfort, now colored by something richer, more profound. Claire looked up and smiled when she noticed Sophie watching. It wasn't the playful smile of old days, nor the gentle reassurance of the past. It was a smile filled with shared understanding, with acknowledgement of the bond they had finally allowed to breathe. Sophie returned it, feeling a warmth bloom that seemed to settle all the restless feelings she had carried for years. They spent the morning in quiet companionship, sipping coffee, sharing stories, and laughing softly at little memories from their past. The weight of unspoken feelings was gone, replaced by something steady and honest. Every glance, every word, carried the depth of a connection built over years, now illuminated with clarity and mutual acknowledgement. Later they decided to take a walk through the nearby park, the world around them fresh and shimmering after last night's rain. Leaves sparkled with dew and birds chirped softly, as if celebrating the peaceful rhythm of life. Sophie and Claire walked side by side, their hands brushing occasionally, a subtle but intimate gesture that neither of them needed to define aloud. "You know," Sophie said, her voice thoughtful, "I used to think that closeness like ours was all I could ever hope for. That admiration and friendship were enough. But now, I see that sometimes, life surprises you with more than you expect." Claire nodded, her eyes reflecting the golden light. "It does," she replied gently. "And sometimes the most meaningful connections are the ones we've always had, waiting patiently for the right moment to grow into something deeper." They paused by a small pond, where ducks floated serenely across the water. Sophie watched her reflection ripple in the surface, then glanced at Claire. There was no need for grand declarations. The understanding between them was complete. Years of shared history, laughter, and quiet support had led them here. And now the future felt full of promise. "I feel happy," Sophie admitted softly. Not just because of us, but because of everything that brought us to this point. Every memory, every small moment. It all matters. Claire reached for her hand, squeezing it lightly. I feel the same, she said. It's rare to find someone who understands you so completely. And even rarer to let yourself be vulnerable enough to share it. I'm grateful we didn't wait too long. They continued walking, their steps slow and unhurried, enjoying the simplicity of togetherness. The conversation turned to lighter topics, books they wanted to read, little plans for the week, and the familiar comfort of shared jokes. And yet, beneath every word, beneath every smile and glance, was the knowledge that their bond had changed forever, enriched by honesty, patience, and love that was tender, gentle, and safe. By the time they returned to Sophie's apartment, the sun was dipping low in the sky, casting long, soft shadows across the streets. They stopped at the doorway, hesitant to let the day end, knowing that even the simplest parting now carried a new significance. Claire's hand lingered in Sophie's for a moment longer than necessary. Thank you, she said quietly, her voice filled with sincerity, for letting me in, for trusting me, and for giving us a chance. Sophie smiled, feeling a quiet swell of emotion. Thank you, she whispered in return, for being patient, for being here, and for making me believe that some things are worth waiting for. Claire leaned in briefly, resting her forehead lightly against Sophie's, a gesture of closeness, trust, and affection that needed no explanation. Then slowly she stepped back, a gentle promise in her eyes. We'll figure it out together, Claire said softly, her hand still brushing against Sophie's. Yes, Sophie agreed, her heart light and full. Together. As Claire walked away, Sophie watched her go, feeling a serene certainty in her chest. Life had shifted subtly, quietly, but profoundly. The years of unspoken longing had not been wasted. They had led to honesty, vulnerability, and a connection stronger than either of them could have imagined. Sophie closed the door behind her godaunt and leaned against it for a moment, breathing deeply. Outside, the city lights twinkled like tiny promises, and Sophie felt a renewed sense of hope. She knew challenges might come, life might test them in unexpected ways, but the foundation they had built, the trust, the understanding, and the deep affection, would carry them forward. That evening, Sophie sat by the window once more, looking out at the city that had seemed so ordinary before. But now it felt different. It felt full of possibility, quiet magic, and the gentle promise of love that was tender, honest, and safe. And somewhere nearby, Claire's presence lingered in Sophie's heart, a constant, unwavering light. Sophie smiled softly, a tear of joy slipping down her cheek. Life had brought her here, to this perfect, quiet moment of understanding and fulfillment. And she knew without a doubt that this was just the beginning of a story that would continue, filled with shared memories, laughter, and love that was real, pure, and everlasting.